Hey there. Tonight we begin with a journey through the moments when the course of human civilization pivoted on the edge of conflict, where the outcomes of single days on battlefields determined the fates of empires and shaped the world we inhabit today, where strategic decisions made under extreme pressure created consequences that rippled through centuries, and where understanding these turning points reveals how contingent history truly is, how different our world might be if these encounters had ended differently. From ancient Greece's stand against Persian expansion to the beaches of Normandy, where the fate of modern democracy hung in balance, from the fields where European knights fell before English archers to the seas where naval supremacy changed hands, the story of history's most consequential battles is one of human courage and fear, of strategic brilliance and terrible miscalculation, and of the ways that armed conflict has repeatedly reshaped the boundaries, beliefs, and possibilities of human societies. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if genuinely enjoying what's shared here. And let those comments know where the listening is happening from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When thinking about history, it's tempting to imagine gradual evolution, steady progress, and change emerging slowly across generations. While much of history does unfold gradually, there are moments, specific days, sometimes specific hours, when the trajectory of civilization shifts dramatically. These moments often occur on battlefields, where the outcomes of military encounters determine which empires rise and which fall, which cultures spread and which retreat, which ideas flourish and which are suppressed. The battles explored tonight aren't simply the largest or the longest, or those with the highest casualties, though many qualify on those measures. Rather, these are encounters that genuinely change the course of world history. Battles where different outcomes would have created fundamentally different worlds, where the consequences extended far beyond the immediate military results to reshape politics, culture, religion, and the possibilities available to subsequent generations. Picture this: a battlefield anywhere in history, where two forces confront each other with the awareness that what happens in the coming hours will determine not just their own fates, but the fates of millions they'll never meet, of societies not yet born, of historical trajectories that will unfold across centuries. The soldiers may not fully grasp the world historical significance of their moment. They're focused on survival, on following orders, on the immediate terror and chaos of combat. But historians looking back can see what they couldn't, that this day, this place, this encounter was a hinge of history. Tonight's journey explores battles from across human history that genuinely altered the world's trajectory. From ancient encounters between Greek city-states and Persian Empire, to modern mechanized warfare that shaped the 20th century, from battles that preserved Western civilization to those that ended it in particular regions, from tactical innovations that revolutionized warfare to strategic decisions that determined which powers would dominate which eras. The story reveals both how conflict has shaped history and how individuals' decisions under extreme pressure have created consequences that echo through ages. The Battle of Marathon represents one of history's earliest decisive encounters, where a small, outnumbered force successfully defended against an empire that seemed unstoppable. The outcome preserved Greek independence and culture at a moment when their absorption into the Persian Empire seemed inevitable, allowing the flourishing of classical Greek civilization that would profoundly influence Western culture for millennia. The context for Marathon lay in the expanding Persian Empire's westward push. Under Darius I, Persia had become the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from India to Egypt, from Central Asia to the Aegean. The Ionian Greek cities in Asia Minor had rebelled against Persian rule in 499 BCE, and Athens had sent ships to support the rebellion. Though the rebellion was crushed, Darius sought to punish Athens and to extend Persian control into mainland Greece. The Persian expedition of 490 BCE aimed to bring Athens and Eretria under Persian control. After destroying Eretria, the Persian force, perhaps 25,000 soldiers transported by several hundred ships, landed on the plain of Marathon, about 26 miles northeast of Athens. The Athenians mobilized their citizen army, roughly 10,000 hoplites, and marched to Marathon to confront the invasion. They were joined by about 1,000 soldiers from Plataea, Athens' only ally to respond to the emergency. The tactical situation seemed to favour the Persians. They had numerical superiority, battle-hardened troops experienced in conquering vast territories, and the world's most successful military system. The Greeks were citizen soldiers, primarily farmers who trained part-time, defending their home but lacking the professional military experience of their opponents. The conventional wisdom suggested that the Persians would win relatively easily. However, the Greek commander Miltiades understood his advantages despite the numbers. The Greek hoplites were heavily armoured infantry, fighting in tight phalanx formation with large shields, long spears and swords for close combat. The Persian forces relied more on archery and lighter infantry, with cavalry as a crucial component. On the plain of Marathon, terrain and timing would prove decisive. Miltiades waited several days, choosing the moment to engage carefully. When he learned that the Persian cavalry had been sent away, possibly to board ships for a direct attack on Athens, he seized the opportunity without the cavalry threat. His heavily armoured hoplites could advance without facing mounted opponents who could manoeuvre around their flanks. The Greek phalanx advanced at a run across the plain, a surprising tactic designed to minimise casualties from Persian arrows during the approach. The Greeks weakened their centre while strengthening their wings, a deliberate strategic choice. As battle was joined, the Persian centre pushed back the weaker Greek centre, creating a bulge in the line. But the strengthened Greek wings defeated the forces opposing them and then wheeled inward, enveloping the Persian forces that had advanced pursuing the retreating Greek centre. The envelopment was decisive. Caught between converging Greek forces, the Persian troops broke and fled toward their ships. The Greeks pursued, capturing several ships and inflicting heavy casualties during the chaotic retreat. The traditional account claimed 6,400 Persian dead against only 192 Athenian casualties, though these numbers may be exaggerated. Regardless of exact figures, the Greek victory was clear and stunning. Immediately after the victory, Pheidippides, or possibly a different runner named Philippides, sources vary, ran back to Athens to bring news of the victory and to warn that Persian ships were sailing to attack the undefended city directly. According to legend, he ran the roughly 26 miles from Marathon to Athens, delivered his message, "We have won," and died from exhaustion. Modern marathon races commemorate this legendary run, though historians debate whether the event occurred exactly as described. The remaining Athenian army marched rapidly back to Athens to defend against the Persian naval approach. Seeing that Athens was defended and having lost the opportunity for surprise, the Persian fleet departed, ending the immediate threat. The significance of Marathon extended far beyond this single tactical victory. Had the Persians conquered Athens in 490 BCE, Greek history would have developed entirely differently. Athens would not have become the cultural and intellectual centre that produced classical drama, philosophy and democratic political theory. The golden age of Athens under Pericles wouldn't have occurred. The artistic and intellectual achievements that influenced all subsequent Western civilization depended on Athens remaining independent. The victory also boosted Greek confidence and established that the Persian Empire, despite its vast resources, could be defeated by smaller forces using superior tactics and fighting for their homes. This psychological impact influenced the later resistance to Xerxes' invasion in 480 to 479 BCE, when Greeks faced even larger Persian forces at Thermopylae, Salamis and Plataea. The political consequences in Athens were significant. The victory strengthened democratic factions and enhanced the prestige of those who had fought. The confidence gained at Marathon contributed to Athens' development as a major naval power and to the cultural flowering of the 5th century BCE that produced Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Socrates, and the Parthenon. The strategic impact demonstrated that disciplined, heavily armed infantry fighting in formation could defeat more numerous but less heavily armed opponents, establishing tactical principles that would influence warfare for centuries. The phalanx formation and the importance of armour and close-ordered discipline became defining features of Greek military success. Marathon's place in cultural memory was immediate and enduring. The battle was celebrated in Athens through monuments, through naming rights, and through the pride successive generations took in their ancestors' achievement. The narrative of the few, defending freedom against the many seeking to impose imperial rule, became a foundational story in Western culture, influencing concepts of liberty and resistance to tyranny. The question of what might have been illuminates Marathon's importance. Without this victory, Persian conquest of Greece seems probable. Persian rule would have integrated Greek territories into an empire with very different political structures, religious practices, and cultural values. The specific developments of Greek philosophy, drama, historical writing, and political theory that occurred in free Greek cities might not have emerged under Persian administration. The entire trajectory of Western civilization, built on foundations laid in classical Greece, would have been fundamentally different. Understanding Marathon requires recognizing both the tactical achievement, a smaller force using terrain and timing to defeat a larger opponent, and the world historical significance that flowed from that achievement. This single day on the plain of Marathon, where roughly 10,000 Greeks faced 25,000 Persians, determined whether Greek culture would flourish independently or would be absorbed into empire. The outcome shaped not just the immediately following decades, but the entire subsequent development of Western civilization, making this battle one of the most consequential encounters in human history. The Battle of Salamis, fought in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Greek mainland in September 480 BCE, represents perhaps the single most important naval battle in world history. The Greek victory against the massive Persian fleet of Xerxes I preserved Greek independence and Western cultural development at a moment when Persian conquest seemed nearly complete. The context was the second Persian invasion of Greece, led by Xerxes I, who sought to succeed where his father Darius had failed, and to avenge Marathon Xerxes assembled an enormous force. Ancient sources claim millions, though modern historians estimate perhaps 200,000 troops supported by over 600 warships. The size was unprecedented, and demonstrated Persian determination to crush Greek resistance permanently. The Persian advance had been largely successful. The heroic but ultimately unsuccessful stand at Thermopylae had delayed but not stopped the Persian army. Athens had been evacuated, and then occupied and burned by Persian forces. Much of Greece had submitted to Persian authority through earth and water, the traditional tokens of submission. The situation appeared desperate for the remaining Greek resistance. The Greek fleet, numbering roughly 370 to 380 warships, with perhaps 200 from Athens, represented the last hope. The Athenian leader Themistocles had convinced Athens to invest in naval power years earlier, using silver from the Laurian mines to build a fleet of triremes, the fast, manoeuvrable warships that represented the height of naval technology. This decision, made years before the invasion, would prove decisive. The strategic choice facing the Greek coalition was whether to defend at Salamis or to withdraw to the Isthmus of Corinth to protect the Peloponnese. Many Greek commanders favoured withdrawal, but Themistocles argued passionately for fighting at Salamis. His reasoning was tactical and political. The narrow waters favoured the more manoeuvrable Greek triremes against the larger Persian fleet, and fighting at Salamis kept the coalition together by defending Athens' interests. Themistocles employed deception to force the battle. He sent a trusted servant to Xerxes with a message claiming to be secret intelligence. The Greeks were planning to escape during the night, and if Xerxes blocked the exits from the strait, he could trap and destroy the entire Greek fleet. Xerxes, eager to deliver the decisive blow, ordered his fleet to seal the exits and to prepare for battle in the strait. The tactical situation now favoured the Greeks. The Persian numerical superiority meant nothing in the narrow waters where only limited numbers could engage simultaneously. The larger Persian ships were less manoeuvrable in confined spaces. The morning wind conditions that typically arose created choppy water that favoured the lower, more stable Greek triremes over the higher Persian vessels. The battle began as the Greek fleet advanced in disciplined formation. The Persian ships, crowded in the narrow strait and lacking room to manoeuvre, couldn't deploy their superior numbers effectively. The Greek triremes used their bronze rams to hold Persian ships below the waterline, the standard naval tactic of the era. The Greeks' better manoeuvrability allowed them to attack vulnerable targets, while avoiding being surrounded. The confined waters became chaotic as damaged Persian ships blocked other Persian vessels trying to engage or to retreat. The very numbers that should have been the Persian advantage became a liability as ships got in each other's way. The Greeks, fighting in home waters and motivated by the knowledge that defeat meant the permanent destruction of their homes and culture, fought with determination that matched their tactical advantages. Xerxes watched the battle from a throne on a hillside overlooking the strait, witnessing his supposedly invincible fleet's destruction. The psychological impact of watching his naval power broken in full view of his land army was significant. The Persian losses were heavy, perhaps 200 ships destroyed or captured against roughly 40 Greek losses, though exact numbers are debated. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. Xerxes' fleet had been his link to his bases and his means of supplying the army in Greece. With naval superiority lost, maintaining a large army in Greece became problematic. Xerxes himself withdrew to Asia with much of the army, leaving a smaller force under Mardonius to continue the campaign. This force would be defeated the following year at Plataea, effectively ending the Persian threat to Greek independence. The preservation of Greek independence allowed the development of the classical civilization that would profoundly influence all subsequent Western culture Athens. Having borne the brunt of the defence, and having provided the majority of the fleet, gained enormous prestige and influence. The Delian League, initially formed to continue defence against Persia, gradually transformed into an Athenian empire that provided the wealth supporting Athens' golden age. The cultural flowering that followed, the drama of Aeschylus, who himself fought at Salamis, Sophocles and Euripides, the philosophy of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, the historical writing of Herodotus and Thucydides, the architecture of the Parthenon, the development of democratic political theory, all depended on Athens remaining independent rather than becoming a Persian satrapy. The political impact extended beyond Athens. The demonstration that the seemingly invincible Persian Empire could be defeated encouraged continued Greek independence and confidence. The concept of free citizens fighting for their homes against imperial tyranny became a foundational narrative in Western political thought, influencing ideas about liberty, democracy and resistance to despotism for millennia. The tactical lessons influenced naval warfare for generations, the importance of maneuverability, the advantages of fighting in confined waters when outnumbered, the value of discipline and coordinated tactics against numerical superiority. All these principles demonstrated at Salamis continued to influence naval strategy long after triremes were obsolete. The what-if scenario illuminates Salamis' significance. Had the Persian fleet won, which seemed entirely possible given their numerical advantage, Greek resistance would have collapsed. Xerxes could have supplied his land forces and could have systematically conquered the remaining independent Greek cities. Under Persian rule, Greek cultural development would have followed different paths, shaped by Persian imperial structures and values rather than by independent democratic experimentation. The subsequent history of Western civilization depended on foundations laid in classical Greece. Philosophy, drama, historical writing, democratic theory, scientific inquiry, all these characteristically Western approaches to understanding the world emerged in the free Greek city-states. Their development under Persian imperial rule seems unlikely, as the specific conditions of Greek independence, political experimentation, and cultural competition between cities created environments where these traditions flourished. Understanding Salamis requires recognizing the contingency of the outcome. The Greek victory wasn't predetermined or inevitable. It resulted from Themistocles' strategic insight, from tactical choices that exploited specific circumstances, from the courage of Greek rowers and marines fighting in home waters, and from Xerxes' decision to accept battle in conditions that favoured his opponents. Different choices at multiple points could have produced different outcomes, making the historical importance of what actually happened all the more striking. The Battle of Salamis thus represents a moment when the trajectory of Western civilization hung in balance. The outcome determined whether the Greek cultural and political experiments would continue, or would be absorbed into Persian Empire. That determination shaped all subsequent Western history, making this naval engagement in the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland one of the most consequential encounters in human experience. The Battle of Gaugamela, fought on October 1st, 331 BCE, near present-day Mosul in Iraq, represented the decisive encounter between Alexander the Great of Macedon and Darius III of Persia. Alexander's victory destroyed the Persian Empire as an independent power, and created the Hellenistic world, where Greek culture spread across the Near East and influenced societies from Egypt to India, shaping the cultural landscape for centuries. The context was Alexander's campaign to conquer the Persian Empire, motivated by a complex mix of vengeance for Persian invasions of Greece, personal ambition, and genuine cultural vision. Alexander had already defeated Persian forces at Granicus, 334 BCE, and Issus, 333 BCE, but the Persian Empire remained intact under Darius III. Gaugamela would be the final confrontation between the two rulers. Darius assembled a massive army, drawing forces from across his vast empire. Estimates vary wildly, with ancient sources claiming up to 1 million troops, while modern historians estimate perhaps 100,000 to 200,000. The force included cavalry from multiple regions, scythed chariots designed to break infantry formations, war elephants, and infantry from diverse ethnic groups. Darius chose the battlefield carefully, selecting a broad plain near the village of Gaugamela, where he could deploy his forces fully, and where his numerical superiority could be decisive. Alexander's army numbered roughly 40,000 to 50,000 troops, substantially smaller than the Persian force but composed of highly trained and experienced soldiers. The Macedonian phalanx, heavily armed infantry fighting in close formation with long sarissa pikes, formed the centre. Elite cavalry units, including the companion cavalry that Alexander personally commanded, formed the decisive striking force the army had fought together for years across the campaigns, creating cohesion and mutual confidence that offset numerical disadvantages. The tactical situation seemingly favoured the Persians. Darius had chosen terrain that negated Alexander's tactical skill in using geographical features. The broad plain allowed the Persians to deploy their full force and to use their cavalry and chariots optimally. The numerical superiority should have allowed them to envelop and overwhelm the smaller Macedonian army. Darius had learned from previous defeats and had prepared specifically to counter Alexander's tactics. The battle began with Alexander's cavalry advancing at an angle toward the Persian left flank, threatening to outflank Darius's position. Darius extended his left to counter, thinning his centre. Alexander's elite cavalry punched through the weakened centre, driving directly toward Darius's position. This was Alexander's characteristic tactic, identifying the enemy commander's location and leading a decisive cavalry charge to strike at the command structure directly. Simultaneously, the Persian cavalry broke through the Macedonian left, creating a crisis as Persian forces poured through the gap and advanced toward the Macedonian camp. The Macedonian phalanx, fighting on multiple fronts, maintained discipline despite being partially surrounded, demonstrating the training and cohesion that Alexander's army had developed through years of campaigning. The decisive moment came as Alexander's cavalry reached Darius's position. Facing the immediate threat of capture or death, Darius fled the battlefield. His departure, visible to much of the army, triggered a general Persian collapse. Troops who might have continued fighting lost cohesion as command structure disintegrated. The Persian army broke and fled in various directions, pursued by Macedonian cavalry that inflicted heavy casualties during the rout. The casualties reflected the battle's decisive nature. Persian losses were estimated in the tens of thousands, though exact figures are impossible to determine. Macedonian losses were reportedly light, perhaps several thousand, though this may reflect victors' bias in the sources. What's clear is that the Persian army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, leaving Darius without the means to continue organised resistance. The strategic consequences were immediate and total. Darius fled eastward, attempting to raise new forces, but was eventually murdered by his own satraps as Alexander pursued the Persian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for 2 centuries, effectively ended at Gaugamela. Alexander conquered the imperial capitals, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana, meeting little organised resistance after the field army's destruction. The creation of Alexander's empire represented more than simple conquest. Alexander's vision included fusing Greek and Persian cultures, encouraging intermarriage between Greeks and local populations, founding Greek cities throughout his conquered territories, and creating a cosmopolitan empire where Greek culture would blend with local traditions. While Alexander's empire fragmented immediately after his death in 323 BCE, the cultural changes he initiated continued and intensified. The Hellenistic period that followed transformed the ancient world. Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, facilitating communication and trade across vast regions. Greek philosophy, art and literature spread throughout the former Persian Empire, influencing and being influenced by local traditions. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's empire, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid kingdom in the Near East and others, maintained Greek cultural dominance while adapting to local circumstances. The cultural synthesis created in the Hellenistic world influenced subsequent history profoundly. Judaism was transformed by contact with Greek thought, creating the intellectual environment from which Christianity would emerge. The Greek translation of Jewish scriptures, the Septuagint, made Jewish religious texts accessible to the broader Hellenistic world. The cosmopolitan cities of the Hellenistic period, Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamum, became centres of learning where Greek and non-Greek traditions interacted creatively. The scientific and mathematical achievements of the Hellenistic period, Euclid's geometry, Archimedes' mechanics and mathematics, Eratosthenes' calculation of Earth's circumference, advances in astronomy and medicine, built on Greek foundations but occurred in the multicultural environment that Alexander's conquests had created. The great libraries and museums of Alexandria represented institutional innovations that preserved and advanced knowledge systematically. The political impact extended through the Roman period and beyond. Alexander's example of combining military conquest with cultural vision influenced Roman imperial thinking. The spread of Greek culture that Alexander initiated created the cultural unity of the Eastern Mediterranean that Rome would inherit and maintain. The persistence of Greek as the common language of the Eastern Roman Empire well into the medieval period reflected the enduring legacy of Hellenization that began with Alexander's conquests. The alternative history illuminates Gaugamella's significance. Had Darius won, the Persian Empire would have continued dominating the Near East Greek culture, would have remained confined to Greece and the Mediterranean coast. The specific synthesis of Greek and Near Eastern traditions that characterized the Hellenistic period wouldn't have occurred, fundamentally altering the cultural landscape from which both Christianity and later Islamic civilization would emerge. The tactical brilliance displayed at Gaugamela, using superior training and cohesion to offset numerical disadvantages, employing combined arms effectively, identifying and exploiting enemy weaknesses, maintaining discipline under pressure, established principles that influenced military thinking for centuries. Alexander's campaigns became standard subjects for military study, with commanders from Julius Caesar to Napoleon studying his tactics and strategies. Understanding Gaugamela requires appreciating both the immediate military achievement, the destruction of a much larger force through tactical superiority, and the world historical consequences that flowed from that victory. This single day on the plains of Gaugamela determined that Greek culture would spread throughout the Near East, that the multicultural Hellenistic world would be created, and that the cultural foundations for subsequent Mediterranean and Near Eastern history would be laid. The battle was decisive not just in military terms, but in shaping the possibilities available to all subsequent societies in these regions, making it one of history's genuinely transformative encounters. The Battle of Tours, fought in October 732 CE, somewhere between the cities of Tours and Poitiers in modern France, halted the northward expansion of Islamic forces into Western Europe. The Frankish victory under Charles Martel prevented Muslim control of Francia, and potentially of all Western Europe, determining that Western Europe would remain Christian rather than becoming part of the Islamic world. The context was the remarkable Islamic expansion of the 7th and early 8th centuries. Beginning with Muhammad's establishment of the first Islamic state in Arabia in the 620s, Muslim armies had conquered the Persian Empire, taken most of the Byzantine Empire's territories, swept across North Africa, crossed into Spain, and were now pushing north through the Pyrenees into Francia. The speed and scope of this expansion were unprecedented, creating a massive Islamic empire within a century of Islam's founding. The conquest of Visigothic Spain had been rapid, accomplished between 711 and 718 CE Muslim forces, largely Berber troops from North Africa, led by Arab commanders, had encountered relatively little organised resistance after initial defeats of Visigothic armies. The subsequent raids into Francia were initially exploratory, testing defences and gathering plunder. but by the early 730s they had become more substantial invasions aimed at permanent conquest. The Umayyad governor of Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, Abd ar-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, led a large force, estimates vary from 20,000 to 80,000 men, northward in 732. The expedition had already sacked Bordeaux and was advancing toward Tours, whose monastery held substantial wealth. The apparent objective was to establish Islamic control over Aquitaine and potentially to conquer all of Francia, which was divided and politically unstable following the decline of the Merovingian dynasty. Charles Martel, the de facto ruler of Francia as mayor of the palace, the Merovingian kings were figureheads by this time, assembled a Frankish army to confront the invasion. The Frankish force probably numbered between 15,000 and 30,000, smaller than the Muslim army but composed of experienced warriors. Charles had spent years fighting to unite Francia and to subdue various internal rivals, creating a force with significant combat experience. The tactical situation involved a clash between two very different military systems. The Islamic forces were primarily cavalry, using hit-and-run tactics, archery from horseback, and rapid manoeuvring to break enemy formations. The Frankish forces were primarily infantry, heavily armed and armoured warriors fighting in close formation, using shields and spears to create a defensive wall. The different tactical approaches would determine the battle's course. The location between Tours and Poitiers provided terrain that favoured the Franks. The exact site is debated, but it appears to have been an area where the Muslim cavalry's mobility advantages were constrained. Charles chose his position carefully, placing his forces where the Muslims would have to attack uphill or across broken ground. The battle lasted perhaps several days, with the Muslim cavalry repeatedly attacking the Frankish infantry formation. The Franks maintained discipline, their shield wall absorbing cavalry charges without breaking. The Muslim tactics that had succeeded against less cohesive opponents failed against the solid Frankish formation. The inability to break the Frankish line frustrated the Muslim commanders and took a psychological toll on their forces. The decisive moment came when Frankish troops, possibly deliberately positioned for this purpose, struck at the Muslim camp and baggage train. The threat to their plunder and supplies drew Muslim forces away from the main battle to defend their camp. In the confusion, Abd ar-Rahman was killed. Sources differ on whether in the main fighting or during the camp raid. His death during the ongoing battle created a leadership crisis. The Muslim forces withdrew during the night, retreating southward and not attempting to renew the battle. Charles, uncertain about the enemy's strength and intentions, didn't pursue aggressively. The campaign was over, with the Muslim invasion force withdrawing to Spain and not returning. Subsequent raids into Francia occurred, but were smaller and were repulsed, never again threatening to conquer Frankish territories. The significance of Tours has been debated by historians. Some argue it was decisive in preventing Islamic conquest of Western Europe, while others suggest that Muslim expansion had already reached its natural limits due to overextension and logistical challenges. The truth probably lies between these extremes. Tours wasn't the only factor stopping Islamic expansion, but it was a genuine turning point that demonstrated Muslim forces could be defeated and that removed the immediate threat to Francia. The historical consequences were substantial. Charles Martel's victory enhanced his prestige and strengthened his hold on power, allowing his dynasty, the Carolingians, to eventually formally replace the Merovingians. His grandson Charlemagne would create a Frankish empire that revived Western European political and cultural unity, fundamentally shaping European development. Without Tours, Charles's position would have been weaker, potentially preventing the Carolingian consolidation of power. The preservation of Christian Western Europe allowed the eventual development of distinctively Western European political and cultural institutions. The relationship between church and state, the development of feudalism, the eventual emergence of representative institutions, and countless other features of Western European history developed in a Christian rather than Islamic context because of the halting of Muslim expansion. The alternative history provides perspective on the battle's importance. Had Tours been a Muslim victory, Francia likely would have fallen under Islamic rule. The subsequent Christianization of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Germany east of the Rhine, Poland and other regions might not have occurred or would have been Islamic instead. The entire religious and cultural map of Europe would have been fundamentally different. However, the speculation has limits. Whether Muslim forces could have maintained control of Francia is questionable. The logistical challenges of governing territories so far from their Mediterranean power bases, the resistance that sustained occupation would have generated, and the internal political dynamics of the Umayyad Caliphate all suggest that even military victory at Tours might not have produced permanent Muslim control of Western Europe. What Tours certainly accomplished was preventing the immediate conquest of Francia in 732 and demonstrating that Muslim military expansion could be stopped. The psychological impact was significant. Charles gained the nickname Martel, the hammer, for his victory, and Christian Europe gained confidence that the seemingly unstoppable Islamic expansion could be resisted successfully. The tactical lessons influenced European military development. The demonstration that disciplined infantry in tight formation could defeat cavalry encouraged continued emphasis on heavy infantry that would characterize European warfare for centuries. The importance of choosing terrain that negated cavalry advantages became a recognized principle. The religious and cultural dimensions were profound. The preservation of Christian Western Europe meant that when European civilization expanded through exploration and colonization after 1500, it spread Christian and Western values rather than Islamic ones. The shape of the modern world, with its Western cultural dominance, however much that's being challenged, reflects partly that Western Europe remained Christian rather than becoming Islamic. Understanding Tours requires acknowledging both its genuine significance and the limitations of any single battle's impact. Charles Martel's victory didn't single-handedly save Western civilization or permanently resolve the Christian-Islamic frontier, but it did stop a specific invasion at a crucial moment, did preserve Frankish independence, and did contribute to the maintenance of Christian Western Europe that would eventually develop into the civilization that spread globally. The battle's importance lies not in wild counterfactuals about completely different worlds, but in recognizing that this specific victory had specific important consequences that shape the world we actually inhabit. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, near the town of Hastings in southern England, determined that William, Duke of Normandy, rather than Harold Godwinson, would rule England. This seemingly dynastic dispute had profound consequences, fundamentally transforming English society, language, culture, and politics, and shaping the subsequent development of Britain and ultimately of the English-speaking world. The context was the succession crisis following the death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066. Edward died childless, leaving the English throne disputed. Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, was crowned king almost immediately, claiming Edward had designated him a successor on his deathbed. William of Normandy claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and that Harold had sworn to support William's claim. Harald Hardrada of Norway also claimed the throne, adding a third contender to the succession dispute. Harold's kingship immediately faced challenges from multiple directions. Harald Hardrada invaded northern England with a Norwegian army. Forcing Harold to march north to defend Harold, won a decisive victory at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, ending the Norwegian threat but leaving his army exhausted. Within days, news arrived that William had landed on the southern coast with a Norman army. Harold force-marched his tired troops south to confront this new threat. William's invasion force numbered perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 troops, including cavalry, archers, and infantry. The composition reflected continental military practices, a combined arms force integrating different troop types into coordinated tactical approaches. The cavalry particularly reflected Norman military culture, where mounted warriors formed the military elite. The logistics of transporting this force across the English Channel, including horses, supplies and equipment, represented a major organisational achievement. Harold's army, perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 strong, consisted primarily of the housecarls, professional soldiers who formed the core of Anglo-Saxon armies, and the fyrd, militia drawn from the countryside. The Anglo-Saxon military system emphasised heavily armed infantry fighting in shield wall formation, similar to earlier Germanic tactical traditions. The housecarls were formidable warriors, experienced and well-equipped, while the fyrd's quality varied depending on how well-trained and equipped different regions' contingents were. The armies met on October 14th on Senlac Hill, later known as Battle Hill, about 7 miles from Hastings. Harold had positioned his forces on the hilltop, creating a defensive position that the Normans would have to attack uphill. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall, formed of men standing shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields, created a formidable defensive barrier. Harold's strategy was to hold this position, forcing William to attack uphill against prepared defences, inflicting casualties until the Norman army was weakened enough to defeat decisively. William's tactical challenge was breaking the shield wall. His initial attacks, infantry assaulting uphill, archers shooting at the defensive line, cavalry attempting to break through, were repulsed. The shield wall held firm and Norman casualties mounted. At one point, rumours spread that William had been killed, threatening to cause panic. William removed his helmet and rode before his troops to show he still lived, rallying his forces to continue fighting. The battle's turning point came through a combination of tactics that may have been partly planned and partly opportunistic. Norman forces feigned retreat, drawing Anglo-Saxon troops away from the defensive line in pursuit. Once the pursuers were separated from the main formation, Norman cavalry turned and cut them down. This tactic was repeated several times, gradually weakening the shield wall as men were drawn out and killed. Late in the day, as the shield wall weakened from casualties and exhaustion, Norman forces finally broke through. Harold was killed. The famous story of an arrow in the eye may be historical or may be later legend based on the Bayeux tapestry depiction, but Harold's death is certain. With their king dead and their defensive position compromised, the Anglo-Saxon forces broke and fled. William had won. The immediate consequences were William's coronation as King of England on Christmas Day 1066 and the beginning of Norman rule. But the profound impacts extended far beyond this dynastic change. William replaced the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with Norman nobles, fundamentally altering England's ruling class. The Domesday Book, William's comprehensive survey of English lands and resources completed in 1086, reflected Norman administrative efficiency and created unprecedented centralisation. The linguistic impact was transformative. Norman French became the language of the court, the aristocracy, and the law, while English remained the language of common people. Over centuries, this created modern English, a Germanic language with massive French vocabulary, producing the rich, flexible language that would eventually become global. The legal terminology, the vocabulary of government and administration, the words for sophisticated concepts, all these entered English from French following the Norman conquest. The architectural legacy included the Norman castles that still dot the English landscape. William built fortifications throughout England to maintain control, introducing the stone castle to English warfare and creating physical symbols of Norman power that shaped English settlement patterns and defensive strategies for centuries. The social and political structures William introduced transformed English governance. The feudal system, while existing in some form in Anglo-Saxon England, was systematised and strengthened under the Normans. The relationship between king and nobles, the obligations and rights that bound them, and the administrative structures that governed the realm all reflected Norman practices adapted to English circumstances. The connection to continental Europe intensified. England's rulers now held substantial territories in France, Normandy initially, eventually much more, creating complex political relationships and eventual conflicts, including the 100 Years' War English history, became intertwined with French history in ways that would persist for centuries and would shape European politics broadly. The development of English common law owed much to Norman influence. While based partly on Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, the systematisation and codification that created English common law occurred under Norman and Angevin, the dynasty descending from William rule. This legal tradition would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world, influencing legal systems across multiple continents. The cultural synthesis that emerged from the Norman conquest created distinctively English literature, art and culture that combined Anglo-Saxon and Norman elements. The tension between these traditions produced creative syntheses that characterised high medieval English culture and eventually contributed to the English Renaissance. The alternative history illuminates Hastings' significance. Had Harold won, England would have remained under Anglo-Saxon rule, maintaining closer connections to Scandinavian rather than continental European culture. The English language would have developed very differently, potentially remaining more purely Germanic. The political development of England, its relationship with continental Europe, and its eventual colonial expansion that spread English language and culture globally, all would have followed different paths. The long-term impact on the English-speaking world is profound. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and other English-speaking nations are products of British expansion that was shaped by the post-conquest development of England, the spread of English as a global language, the legal systems based on English common law, and the political traditions derived from English constitutional development all trace back through paths that the Norman conquest fundamentally shaped. Understanding Hastings requires recognising that a single day's battle, one that Harold nearly won, and that turned on tactical details and on Harold's death at a crucial moment, set England on a path fundamentally different from what would have unfolded under continued Anglo-Saxon rule. The fusion of Norman and Anglo-Saxon elements created England as we know it, with consequences that eventually spread English influence globally. This makes Hastings not just an important English battle, but one with genuine world historical significance that continues to shape our present. As this exploration of history's most consequential battles concludes, what emerges is recognition of how contingent historical development truly is, how specific outcomes in specific encounters determined which empires rose and which fell, which cultures spread and which were confined or destroyed, and which possibilities remained open for subsequent generations. The battles examined here weren't merely military encounters, but genuine hinges of history where different outcomes would have created fundamentally different worlds. The pattern revealed across these battles is striking. In each case, the outcome wasn't predetermined or inevitable, but resulted from combinations of strategic planning, tactical execution, individual decisions under pressure, chance, and circumstances beyond anyone's complete control. Marathon's outcome depended on Miltiades' tactical insight and timing. Salamis turned on Themistocles' strategic deception, and on fighting occurring in conditions favouring Greek ships. Gaugamela was determined by Alexander's tactical brilliance, but also by Darius's flight at the crucial moment. Tours reflected Charles Martel's defensive discipline, and Abd ar-Rahman's death during battle. Hastings hinged on Harold's death, and on the successful feigned retreats that broke the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. In each instance, different decisions or different circumstances could plausibly have produced different outcomes. These battles weren't foreordained victories for the winners, but rather encounters that could have gone either way, making their actual outcomes all the more historically significant. The world we inhabit reflects these specific results, rather than the alternatives that might have occurred. The recognition of contingency carries philosophical implications about historical understanding. History isn't simply the unfolding of inevitable patterns, or the working out of vast impersonal forces that determine outcomes regardless of individuals' actions. Rather, history emerges from the interaction of long-term structural factors, with immediate choices and actions, with specific moments where individual decisions and chance events create lasting consequences that shape all subsequent development. Yet the significance of battles shouldn't be overstated or misunderstood. These encounters mattered enormously, but they occurred within larger contexts that shaped their impacts. Marathon and Salamis preserved Greek independence, but that independence was maintained through subsequent efforts across generations. Gaugamela destroyed the Persian Empire, but the Hellenistic synthesis that followed required decades of cultural interaction beyond the immediate military conquest tours, halted one invasion, but securing Christian Europe required centuries of subsequent defence and competition. Hastings determined England's immediate ruler, but creating the England that would eventually dominate globally required centuries of development shaped by countless additional factors. Understanding these battles' importance thus requires nuanced recognition of both their genuine world historical significance and the complex processes through which their immediate military outcomes translated into lasting cultural, political and social consequences. The battles were necessary but not sufficient causes of the worlds they helped create. Necessary because different outcomes would have prevented those specific developments, but not sufficient because the outcomes required sustained effort across generations to produce their full impacts. The human dimensions of these encounters remain striking across centuries. The soldiers who fought at Marathon or Salamis, at Gaugamela or Tours or Hastings, were individuals with their own fears, hopes and motivations. Most probably didn't fully comprehend the world historical significance of their moments. They focused on survival, on fulfilling duty, on loyalty to comrades and commanders, on the immediate realities of combat. yet their collective actions created outcomes that shaped civilizations and that continue to affect billions of people who live in worlds these ancient battles helped form. The strategic and tactical insights demonstrated across these battles continue to inform military thinking. The importance of terrain, timing and tactics, the value of discipline and training, the decisive impact of morale and leadership, the advantages possible for smaller forces using superior tactics against numerical superiority. All these principles illustrated in ancient battles remain relevant to understanding conflict even as technology transforms warfare's material circumstances. The ethical questions raised by celebrating battles and military conquest deserve acknowledgement. These encounters involve terrible human costs, thousands dying, communities destroyed, suffering on vast scales. Recognizing battle's historical significance shouldn't glorify violence or suggest that warfare is desirable or inevitable. Rather, honest historical understanding requires grappling with the reality that human conflict has repeatedly shaped history in profound ways, for better and worse, and that understanding our past requires confronting this difficult truth. The contemporary relevance of studying these battles extends beyond military history to broader questions about how societies change, how cultures interact, how power operates, and how historical legacies shape present possibilities. The worlds created by these battles, the preservation of Greek independence allowing Western philosophical traditions to develop, the spread of Hellenistic culture creating foundations for Christianity and Islamic civilization, the maintenance of Christian Western Europe shaping European expansion, the forging of England setting foundations for the English-speaking world, all these continue to influence our present in ways both visible and subtle. The future implications of understanding this contingency are significant. If history's trajectory reflects specific outcomes of specific encounters rather than inevitable patterns, then our own present moment contains possibilities that future outcomes will determine. The recognition that Marathon's losers would have created very different subsequent histories should inspire awareness that our current choices and actions similarly shape futures that remain open rather than predetermined. As light returns and this journey through history's most consequential battles concludes, the image that perhaps lingers is of countless individuals across millennia, standing on battlefields, facing moments whose full significance they couldn't grasp, making decisions and taking actions whose consequences would echo through centuries. They were humans like us, sometimes brave, sometimes terrified, sometimes brilliant, sometimes mistaken, always operating with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. Their moments became history's hinges, not because they were destined to be decisive, but because specific circumstances and specific choices produced specific outcomes that subsequent generations built upon, creating paths that led eventually to our present. Understanding these battles means recognizing both their contingency and their consequence, both how easily things might have been different and how profoundly the actual outcome shaped the world we inhabit. In that recognition lies both humility about historical understanding's limits and appreciation for history's genuine significance informing the possibilities within which we live our lives and imagine our futures. The Battle of Cannae, fought on August 2nd, 216 BCE in southeastern Italy, represents perhaps the most perfect example of tactical annihilation in military history. Hannibal Barca's Carthaginian army, outnumbered by Roman forces, achieved a double envelopment that destroyed nearly an entire Roman army. The tactical brilliance displayed has been studied by military commanders for over 2 millennia, while the battle's immediate consequences brought Rome to the brink of defeat in the Second Punic War. The context was Hannibal's audacious invasion of Italy following the First Punic War. After the Romans had defeated Carthage and stripped them of their empire, Carthaginian resentment simmered. Hannibal, son of the great general Hamilcar Barca, had sworn as a child to be Rome's eternal enemy. When he came to command Carthaginian forces in Spain, he prepared for war by building a diverse army of Iberians, Celts, Numidians and Carthaginians into a formidable fighting force. His invasion route was legendary, crossing the Alps with elephants in 218 BCE, an achievement that astounded contemporaries and that demonstrated the determination and organisational capability that characterised Hannibal's generalship. The crossing cost him roughly half his army to cold, hunger and alpine tribes, but the survivors who descended into Italy were hardened veterans who had accomplished what Romans thought impossible. Hannibal's early victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene shocked Rome and demonstrated his tactical superiority. These defeats led Rome to appoint Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius adopted a strategy of avoiding direct battle, shadowing Hannibal's army, attacking foragers and supply lines, and gradually wearing down the invaders without risking another catastrophic defeat. This Fabian strategy frustrated Romans eager for decisive victory, but was militarily sound given the circumstances. Roman impatience with Fabian tactics led to the election of two consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who were expected to bring Hannibal to battle and destroy him. They assembled a massive army, perhaps 80,000 to 86,000 infantry and cavalry, the largest Roman army ever fielded. The strategy was straightforward: use overwhelming numerical superiority to crush Hannibal's smaller force through sheer weight of numbers. Hannibal's army numbered roughly 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, substantially smaller than the Roman force. However, his cavalry superiority, roughly 10,000 to Rome's 6,000, would prove decisive. His infantry included diverse troops, tough Spanish and Celtic warriors in the centre, and the elite African infantry, wearing armour stripped from Romans killed in earlier battles, on the flanks. The battlefield at Cannae was a relatively flat plain near the Aufidus River in Apulia. Hannibal deployed his forces in a shallow crescent formation, with the convex side facing the Romans. The weaker Gallic and Spanish infantry formed the centre, bulging toward the enemy. The stronger African infantry formed the flanks, set back from the centre. The cavalry deployed on both wings, the Numidian light cavalry on one side, the heavier Iberian and Celtic cavalry on the other. The Roman deployment was conventional: dense infantry formation in the centre, cavalry on the flanks. The Romans actually reduced their formation's depth somewhat to extend their front and match Hannibal's width, but they remained much deeper than usual, creating an enormously dense mass of infantry that would advance to overwhelm the Carthaginian centre through sheer weight. The battle began with cavalry combat on both flanks. On one flank, Hannibal's superior cavalry defeated their Roman counterparts relatively quickly. On the other flank, the fighting was more prolonged but resulted in the same outcome. The crucial factor was that Hannibal's cavalry won decisively on both flanks, driving the Roman cavalry from the field and freeing the Carthaginian cavalry to intervene elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Roman infantry advanced against the Carthaginian centre. The Spanish and Celtic troops slowly gave ground under the massive pressure, the crescent gradually inverting as they retreated in good order. The Romans pressed forward eagerly, sensing victory as the enemy centre gave way. The dense Roman formation compressed further as the centre pushed deeper into Hannibal's formation, reducing manoeuvrability. This was exactly what Hannibal had planned. As the Roman centre advanced, the African infantry on the flanks wheeled inward, attacking the Roman formation from the sides simultaneously. The victorious Carthaginian cavalry returned from routing the Roman cavalry and attacked from the rear. The Romans found themselves surrounded. The crescent that had seemed to be breaking was actually closing around them like a trap. The annihilation was methodical and terrible. Packed tightly together, unable to manoeuvre, attacked from all directions, the Roman legions were systematically slaughtered. The massacre continued for hours as Carthaginian forces worked inward, killing Romans who couldn't effectively fight back due to the compression of their own formation. Individual valour meant nothing in this situation. The tactical disaster made resistance increasingly futile. The casualties were staggering. Roman sources claim 50,000 to 70,000 Romans killed, including the consul Paulus, 2 proconsuls, 48 of 80 senators who had accompanied the army, and thousands of knights and officers. Only about 15,000 Romans escaped. Hannibal's losses were roughly 6,000, primarily the Gauls who had borne the brunt of the Roman assault on the centre. The disparity represents one of the most lopsided major battle outcomes in history. The immediate impact was catastrophic for Rome. Italy seemed open to conquest. Many of Rome's Italian allies defected to Carthage, calculating that Rome was doomed. The city of Capua, second only to Rome in Italy, went over to Hannibal. Rome itself prepared for siege, with panic in the streets and desperate measures to raise new armies from whoever could bear arms. Yet Rome didn't surrender. The Senate refused even to discuss peace terms, executing those who suggested submission. New armies were raised from younger men, older men, even from slaves who were promised freedom for service, the Roman capacity to absorb defeats that would have destroyed other states and to continue fighting with apparently inexhaustible determination began to manifest. Strategically, Hannibal faced a dilemma that Cannae couldn't resolve. He had destroyed Roman armies but couldn't capture Rome itself, without siege equipment and naval support that Carthage didn't provide. The Fabian strategy resumed. Rome avoided direct battle with Hannibal's main army, while gradually reconquering the Italian cities that had defected, while also opening new fronts in Spain and eventually in Africa itself. The long-term strategic impact was that Cannae, despite being a perfect tactical victory, couldn't produce strategic success without broader support. Hannibal remained in Italy for years, gradually losing strength as Rome's strategy of attrition and the opening of multiple fronts slowly turned the war's momentum. Eventually, Scipio Africanus invaded Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal, who was finally defeated at Zama in 202 BCE, ending the Second Punic War with Carthaginian defeat. The tactical legacy of Cannae has been enormous. The double envelopment, attacking simultaneously from flanks and rear to surround and annihilate an enemy force, became the ideal toward which commanders aspired German military planning before World War I explicitly sought to achieve Cannae against France, attempting envelopment on a strategic rather than tactical scale. Military academies worldwide study Cannae as the exemplar of perfect tactical execution. The historical significance lies partly in what didn't happen. Had Rome surrendered after Cannae, the subsequent history of the Mediterranean world would have been entirely different. Carthaginian rather than Roman dominance would have shaped the region's development. The Roman legal traditions, political institutions, and cultural achievements that influenced all subsequent Western civilization depended on Rome surviving this crisis and eventually prevailing in the Punic Wars. The demonstration of Roman resilience was perhaps as historically important as the battle itself. Rome's refusal to surrender despite catastrophic defeat, its capacity to raise new armies despite devastating casualties, and its strategic patience in avoiding further decisive battles while gradually wearing down Hannibal, established patterns of Roman determination that would characterize the Republic's subsequent expansion. The same qualities that allowed survival after Cannae enabled Rome's eventual domination of the Mediterranean world. Understanding Cannae requires appreciating both the tactical perfection that made it militarily significant and the broader strategic context that limited its war-winning potential. Hannibal's genius produced a masterpiece of tactical annihilation, but perfect tactics couldn't overcome strategic limitations and Roman determination. The battle remains important as the supreme example of tactical excellence, while also illustrating that tactics alone, however brilliant, cannot determine strategic outcomes without broader support and favourable circumstances. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415 in northern France, saw a heavily outnumbered English army under King Henry V defeat a much larger French force through tactical innovation and the devastating effectiveness of the English longbow. The victory had immediate political consequences in the 100 Years' War and broader significance in demonstrating that well-positioned infantry armed with effective missile weapons could defeat cavalry charges, contributing to the transformation of medieval warfare. The context was Henry V's campaign to assert English claims to the French throne and to regain territories in France that previous English kings had held, landing in Normandy with roughly 12,000 men in August 1415. Henry captured Harfleur after a lengthy siege that cost him substantial casualties to disease and combat. By October, his army had been reduced to perhaps 6,000 to 9,000 men, exhausted, sick, and trying to reach the English-controlled port of Calais. The French had assembled a much larger force. Estimates vary from 12,000 to 36,000, with most modern historians suggesting around 20,000 to 25,000. The French army included the flower of French nobility, confident that their numerical superiority and their heavily armoured cavalry would crush the English force. The French strategy was to intercept the English before they reached Calais, to force battle, and to destroy or capture Henry's army. The armies met near the village of Agincourt, on ground that would decisively influence the battle's outcome. The field was relatively narrow, bordered by woods on both sides, constricting the French ability to use their numerical superiority. The ground was freshly ploughed and had been soaked by recent rains, creating muddy conditions that would profoundly affect cavalry charges and infantry movement. Henry deployed his forces carefully. The English men-at-arms, heavily armoured infantry equipped with weapons for close combat, formed the centre, the longbowmen deployed on the flanks, and possibly also among the men-at-arms in the centre, creating positions where they could shoot at the French forces with interlocking fields of fire. The longbowmen hammered sharpened stakes into the ground in front of their positions, creating obstacles to break up cavalry charges. The English longbow was a fearsome weapon that required years of training to use effectively, but that could shoot arrows capable of penetrating armour at considerable ranges, and that could maintain rates of fire that created devastating arrow storms when thousands of archers shot together. English law required regular archery practice, creating a trained archer population that could be mobilised for war. The longbow gave English forces a significant tactical advantage in situations where it could be employed effectively. The French deployed in 3 divisions, primarily dismounted men-at-arms who would advance on foot supported by crossbowmen and with cavalry on the flanks. The decision to dismount most forces reflected lessons from earlier battles where mounted cavalry had been defeated by English archers, but it created different problems by reducing mobility and making the advance across muddy ground exhausting. The battle began with a French cavalry charge aimed at disrupting the English archers. The charges were met with dense arrow storms that killed horses and wounded or killed riders. The muddy ground impeded the charges, and the stakes prevented effective contact with the archer positions. The French cavalry broke and retreated, some fleeing back through their own advancing infantry and creating disorder. The main French infantry advance, heavily armoured men-at-arms slogging through mud, was exhausting and slow. As they advanced, English archers shot thousands of arrows into the densely packed formation. While the armour protected against many arrows, the sheer volume meant that casualties accumulated, horses panicked, and wounded men fell, creating obstacles that impeded those following. When the French finally reached the English lines, they were exhausted from the advance, crowded together in the narrow field, and facing relatively fresh defenders who had been standing in defensive positions. The fighting was fierce and brutal, with the French numbers potentially creating an advantage if they could bring their full force to bear. However, the compression in the narrow field and the mud that had exhausted the attackers negated much of the numerical advantage. The longbowmen, seeing the men-at-arms engage, dropped their bows and joined the fighting with mallets, swords and axes. The lightly armed archers, fresh and mobile, could move around the struggling mass of heavily armoured men-at-arms, attacking from flanks and rear, pulling French knights from the press and killing them. The muddy conditions that had exhausted the French in their advance now trapped them. Fallen knights couldn't rise easily in their heavy armour in the mud, and many drowned in mud or were killed while helpless. The 2nd French Division advanced and met a similar fate, adding to the confusion and carnage without breaking through the English lines. The 3rd Division, seeing the disaster unfolding, largely refused to advance, with most troops withdrawing from the field rather than continuing the futile assaults. The victory was complete. French casualties were enormous, perhaps 6,000 to 10,000 killed, including thousands of nobles and knights. English casualties were relatively light, perhaps a few hundred killed, though the exact numbers are debated. The disparity reflected the one-sided nature of the combat once the English tactical advantages were established. The immediate political impact was significant. Henry V had secured his army's safe withdrawal and had won a stunning victory that enhanced his prestige and that strengthened English claims in France. The Treaty of Troyes, 1420, would recognise Henry as heir to the French throne, though Henry's death in 1422 prevented him from actually uniting the crowns. The victory demonstrated that even in their weakened state the English could defeat much larger French forces, complicating French efforts to expel the English from France. The tactical lessons were profound. Agincourt dramatically demonstrated that well-positioned infantry with effective missile weapons could defeat cavalry and could overcome substantial numerical disadvantages if the terrain favoured the defence. The battle reinforced trends toward infantry-based armies and toward the importance of missile weapons that had been developing throughout the later medieval period. The cultural impact in England was enormous and lasting. Agincourt became a symbol of English valour and of triumph against overwhelming odds. the battle entered English national mythology as a defining moment, celebrated in chronicles in literature, most famously Shakespeare's Henry V, and in popular memory the image of the English longbowmen defeating French cavalry became iconic, representing English military prowess and national character. The broader military evolution that Agincourt exemplified would continue throughout the 15th century. The effectiveness of missile weapons against cavalry and the importance of terrain and defensive positions in negating cavalry advantages encouraged the development of firearms, which would eventually displace both longbows and cavalry as the dominant forces on European battlefields. Agincourt was part of the transition from cavalry-dominated medieval warfare to infantry and firepower-dominated early modern warfare. The what-if scenario reveals Agincourt's limitations as a turning point. Had the French won, the immediate impact would have been Henry V's capture, or death, and the elimination of English military presence in France at that moment. However, the underlying factors in the Hundred Years' War, English claims to French territory, French divisions, economic factors, and various political dynamics, would have continued to operate. Agincourt influenced the war's course, but didn't determine its ultimate outcome, which took decades more and was finally resolved in France's favour when England lost all French territories except Calais by 1453. Understanding Agincourt requires recognising both its immediate military significance, a brilliant tactical victory that demonstrated effective use of combined infantry and archers, excellent use of terrain, and good leadership, and its place in broader historical patterns. The battle exemplified transitions in medieval warfare, contributed to English national identity formation, and influenced military thinking about tactics and weapons. While not perhaps as world historically decisive as Marathon or Hastings, Agincourt significantly impacted the Hundred Years' War, and became culturally significant in ways that extended beyond its immediate military results, making it genuinely important in the history of warfare and of English national development. The Battle of Lepanto, fought on October 7, 1571, in the Gulf of Patra off southwestern Greece, was the largest naval battle in the Mediterranean since ancient times. The Holy League's fleet, composed of Spanish, Venetian and Papal forces, decisively defeated the Ottoman navy, marking the limit of Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean and arguably representing the last major battle, fought primarily by oar-powered galleys, closing an era of naval warfare that stretched back to antiquity. The context was Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean throughout the 16th century. Under Suleiman the Magnificent and his successors, the Ottoman Empire had become a major naval power, dominating the eastern Mediterranean and threatening Christian territories. The conquest of Cyprus from Venice in 1570–71, accomplished with brutal siege warfare and mass killings, galvanised Christian Europe to respond. Pope Pius V organised a Holy League of Spain, Venice, Genoa and smaller states to confront Ottoman power. The Holy League assembled a fleet of roughly 206 galleys and 6 galleasses, larger, heavily armed vessels, carrying perhaps 28,000 to 30,000 soldiers and around 40,000 to 50,000 rowers. The fleet was commanded by Don John of Austria, illegitimate son of Charles V, and half-brother to Philip II of Spain, a young commander whose appointment balanced the various factions within the alliance. The fleet included forces from Spain, Venice, Genoa, the Papal States, Savoy, and various other Italian states, creating a genuinely international force unified by religion and shared concern about Ottoman expansion. The Ottoman fleet numbered roughly 230 to 260 galleys and galleots, carrying perhaps 25,000 to 35,000 soldiers and similar numbers of rowers. The commander was Ali Pasha, an experienced admiral who had led numerous successful operations. The Ottoman fleet was confident, having dominated the Mediterranean for decades and having recently conquered Cyprus despite Venetian resistance. The opposing fleets met in the Gulf of Patras near Lepanto. The battle formation was conventional for galley warfare, ships arranged in lines, preparing to ram and board enemy vessels in close combat. The galleys were propelled by oars with limited sailing capability, making naval tactics relatively constrained compared to later sailing ship warfare. The galleasses, unique to the Christian fleet, were positioned ahead of the main line, creating mobile fortresses that could rain fire on approaching Ottoman ships. The battle began with Ottoman galleys attempting to surround the Christian wings, using superior numbers and maneuverability to envelope the enemy. The Christian centre, under Don John's direct command, engaged the Ottoman centre under Ali Pasha in fierce fighting. The galleasses' firepower was decisive in disrupting Ottoman formations and inflicting casualties before the main engagement. The fighting was brutal close-quarters combat as galleys rammed each other and soldiers boarded enemy vessels. The clash of thousands of men in hand-to-hand combat on the decks of galleys created scenes of extraordinary violence. The soldiers wore armour and fought with swords, pikes, arquebuses and crossbows. The confined spaces of galley decks made the fighting particularly savage, with little room for manoeuvre and nowhere for defeated forces to retreat. The turning point came as the Christian centre broke through the Ottoman centre, with Ali Pasha being killed and his flagship captured. The loss of the commanding admiral visible to much of the fleet created psychological impact that rippled through the Ottoman formation. Simultaneously, the Christian wings held against Ottoman attempts at envelopment and began to gain advantages. As the Ottoman centre collapsed, the entire formation began to disintegrate. Some Ottoman galleys fled successfully, but many were captured or destroyed. The pursuit continued until darkness ended the fighting. The Ottoman losses were catastrophic, perhaps 30,000 killed or captured, roughly 200 galleys destroyed or captured, and the fleet's effective destruction as a fighting force. Christian losses were significant, around 7,500 killed and perhaps 20,000 wounded, but nothing approaching the Ottoman casualties. The immediate strategic impact was the elimination of Ottoman naval dominance in the Mediterranean. While the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet relatively quickly, they never again achieved the clear superiority they had enjoyed before Lepanto. The psychological impact was enormous. The apparently invincible Ottoman navy had been decisively defeated, demonstrating that Ottoman power had limits and that Christian forces could win major victories. The battle's cultural impact in Christian Europe was profound. Lepanto was celebrated as a great victory of Christendom against Islam, depicted in art, commemorated in festivals, and remembered as a turning point when Ottoman expansion was halted. The young soldier Miguel de Cervantes, who fought at Lepanto and was wounded, later drew on his experiences in his writings, including Don Quixote. The battle entered European cultural memory as a defining moment of Christian resistance to Ottoman power. However, the long-term strategic impact was more limited than contemporary celebration suggested. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet and continued to be a major power in the Mediterranean. Cyprus remained under Ottoman control. The battle didn't reverse Ottoman territorial gains. The Holy League fragmented after the victory, with Venice eventually making separate peace with the Ottomans. The decisive strategic advantage that contemporaries thought Lepanto had created proved ephemeral, as political divisions within Christian Europe prevented sustained exploitation of the victory. The technological significance was considerable. Lepanto was effectively the last major battle dominated by all-powered galleys. The galleasses' effectiveness demonstrated the increasing importance of artillery in naval warfare. Within decades, sailing ships with broadside cannon would dominate naval warfare, making galleys increasingly obsolete. Lepanto thus marked the end of an era of naval warfare that stretched back to ancient times, with the battle tactics and ship types used at Lepanto becoming quickly outdated. The symbolic importance outlasted the immediate strategic impact. Lepanto came to represent the furthest extent of Ottoman expansion into Europe, marking a turning point from Ottoman advance to a long period of balance and eventual Ottoman decline. While this interpretation overstates the battle's immediate effects, the broader pattern of Ottoman expansion being checked and then reversed did begin in this period, with Lepanto serving as a symbolic marker, even if the actual turning point involved many factors beyond this single battle. The liberation of thousands of Christian galley slaves rowing in Ottoman galleys provided powerful propaganda for the Christian victory. The galley warfare of this era depended on massive numbers of rowers, many of them slaves or prisoners, rowing under terrible conditions. The freeing of Christian slaves from Ottoman galleys became part of Lepanto's celebratory narrative, though the Christian fleet also employed galley slaves who remained in bondage. Understanding Lepanto requires balancing contemporary perceptions of its significance with more nuanced assessment of its actual impacts. The battle was genuinely important militarily, a decisive victory that destroyed Ottoman naval power temporarily and that demonstrated Ottoman vulnerability. It was enormously significant culturally and psychologically in Christian Europe, becoming a touchstone of Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion. But its long-term strategic impact was limited by the Holy League's inability to maintain unity and to exploit the victory decisively. The battle marked a transition point more than it created sudden transformation. But transition points matter in history, making Lepanto a genuinely significant, if somewhat overstated, milestone in Mediterranean history and in Christian-Ottoman relations. As this comprehensive exploration of history's most consequential battles concludes, what emerges most powerfully is recognition of how profoundly contingent historical development truly is, how specific outcomes in specific encounters determined which empires rose and which fell, which cultures spread and which were confined or destroyed, which ideologies triumphed and which were suppressed, and which possibilities remained open for subsequent generations. The battles examined here span more than 2 millennia, from ancient Marathon to World War II's Stalingrad. Yet they share common characteristics. Each represented a moment when the historical trajectory pivoted, when the outcome of armed conflict determined not just immediate political and military results, but longer-term cultural, social, and political development. Each involved human decisions made under extreme pressure, tactical and strategic choices whose consequences extended far beyond what the decision-makers could have anticipated. The pattern of contingency revealed across these battles is striking and humbling. Marathon's outcome depended on Miltiades' tactical insight and timing, on the absence of Persian cavalry at the crucial moment, on Greek hoplites' discipline in their charge across the plain. Salamis turned on Themistocles' strategic deception, on Xerxes' decision to accept battle in narrow waters, on wind and sea conditions that favoured Greek triremes Gaugamela was determined by Alexander's cavalry breakthrough, and by Darius's flight at the crucial moment. Cannae showcased Hannibal's tactical genius, but also revealed strategic limitations. Perfect tactics without strategic support couldn't win wars. Tours halted Islamic expansion through Charles Martel's defensive discipline and Abd ar-Rahman's death during battle. Hastings hinged on Harold's death, and on Norman cavalry's successful feigned retreats. Agincourt demonstrated how terrain and longbows could defeat numerical superiority, but also showed battle's limited impact without broader strategic exploitation. Lepanto marked Ottoman naval power's limits, while demonstrating galley warfare's end. Waterloo's outcome depended on Wellington's defensive skill, Blucher's determination to support his ally, Napoleon's tactical errors, and the courage and endurance of soldiers fighting in terrible conditions. Stalingrad turned on Soviet willingness to pay horrific cost to hold the city, on German strategic overreach, and on the successful encirclement that trapped an entire German army. In each instance, different decisions or different circumstances could plausibly have produced different outcomes. The battles weren't foreordained victories for the winners, but rather encounters where the outcome was uncertain until decided by combat. This recognition of contingency carries profound implications for historical understanding. History isn't simply the inevitable unfolding of predetermined patterns, but rather emerges from interactions between long-term structural factors and immediate choices and events. The structural factors matter enormously. The economic resources available to different powers, the technological capabilities they possessed, the political institutions they developed, the geographical circumstances they operated within. All these shaped what was possible and what was likely Rome's capacity to absorb catastrophic defeats, like Cannae, and continue fighting reflected structural strengths of the Roman system. Britain's Industrial Revolution gave it resources that helped determine Napoleonic War's outcomes. The Soviet Union's vast population and resources made sustaining resistance to Germany possible, despite catastrophic initial defeats. Yet within these structural constraints, specific battles mattered, because they determined which of multiple, possible paths history would actually follow. The structural factors didn't predetermine outcomes, but rather shaped the range of possibilities. Specific encounters then selected among those possibilities, creating the actual historical path rather than the alternatives that might have occurred. The human dimensions remained striking across all these battles. The commanders who made strategic and tactical decisions, the soldiers who fought and died, the populations whose fates were determined, all were individuals with their own thoughts, fears, hopes, and motivations. Most probably didn't fully comprehend their moment's world historical significance. They focused on survival, on duty, on immediate circumstances, yet their collective actions created outcomes that shaped civilizations. The courage displayed across these battles deserves recognition, even while acknowledging the tragedy of warfare. The Greek hoplites charging across Marathon's plain, the sailors rowing triremes into combat at Salamis, Alexander's cavalry charging toward Darius at Gaugamela, the Romans standing in increasingly impossible situations at Cannae, the Frankish infantry holding against repeated cavalry charges at Tours, Harold's housecarls dying around their king at Hastings, the English archers at Agincourt, the sailors fighting hand-to-hand at Lepanto, Wellington's infantry forming squares against French cavalry at Waterloo, the Soviet soldiers defending Stalingrad's ruins, all displayed human courage under extreme conditions, fighting for causes ranging from noble to misguided, but demonstrating human capacity for sacrifice and endurance. The strategic and tactical insights demonstrated across these battles continue informing military thinking, even as technology transforms warfare's material circumstances. The importance of terrain and timing, the value of discipline and training, the decisive impact of morale and leadership, the advantages possible through superior tactics against numerical superiority. These principles illustrated in ancient battles remain relevant to understanding conflict. The specific tactics and technologies change, but underlying principles about how force, psychology, and strategy interact persist across vast technological changes. The ethical questions raised by celebrating battles and military conquest deserve continued acknowledgement and reflection. These encounters involved terrible human costs, hundreds of thousands dying across the battles examined here, communities destroyed, suffering on scales difficult to fully comprehend. Recognizing battle's historical significance shouldn't glorify violence or suggest warfare is desirable or inevitable. Rather, honest historical understanding requires grappling with the reality that human conflict has repeatedly shaped history profoundly, and that understanding our past requires confronting this difficult truth, while also considering how to build futures where such conflicts become less frequent or less catastrophic. The methodology of studying decisive battles has limitations worth acknowledging. Focusing on dramatic military encounters can obscure the longer-term processes, the structural factors, the everyday experiences, and the countless other historical forces that shape societies. Battles are visible, dramatic, and well documented, making them appealing subjects, but they're only part of history's fabric. The challenge is balancing recognition of battles' genuine importance with awareness that they occurred within broader contexts that shape their impacts, and that historical change involves much more than military conflict alone. The contemporary relevance of studying these battles extends beyond military history to broader questions about historical understanding, about how societies change, about the roles of contingency and structure in shaping outcomes, and about how to think about causation in complex historical processes. The recognition that Marathon's losers would have created very different subsequent histories should inspire awareness that our own present moment contains possibilities that future outcomes will determine. The future implications include thinking about how contemporary conflicts might be viewed by future historians as similarly decisive, or, alternatively, as less important than they appear to participants. The uncertainty about which current events will prove genuinely historically significant parallels, the uncertainty that faced participants in the battles examined here, most of whom couldn't have known they were living through world historical turning points. As light returns and this extensive journey through history's most consequential battles concludes, the image that lingers is of countless individuals across millennia and continents standing on battlefields, facing moments whose full significance they couldn't grasp, making decisions and taking actions whose consequences would echo through centuries and millennia. They were humans like us, capable of courage and fear, brilliance and error, nobility and pettiness, operating with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. Their moments became history's hinges not because they were destined to be decisive, but because specific circumstances combined with specific choices produced specific outcomes that subsequent generations built upon, creating paths that led eventually to our present. Understanding these battles means recognizing both their contingency, how easily things might have been different, and their consequence, how profoundly the actual outcome shaped the world we inhabit. In that recognition lies both humility about historical understanding's limits and appreciation for history's genuine significance, informing the possibilities within which we live our lives and imagine our futures. The battles explored here, from Marathon's plain to Stalingrad's ruins, were moments when human conflict determined civilization's trajectories, creating the foundations upon which our present world was built. They deserve study not to glorify warfare, but to understand how we arrived at our present circumstances, and to reflect on how the choices we make under our own pressures and uncertainties may similarly shape possibilities for generations yet unborn. The responsibility that comes with such understanding is to learn from these past conflicts, while working toward futures where human potential is expressed through creation rather than destruction, where conflicts are resolved through means less costly than the battles that have so profoundly shaped our past.